Few names in history inspire as much awe and terror as Genghis Khan. To his followers, he was the Great Khan, a visionary leader who united scattered tribes and forged the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever known. His military genius and administrative skills are studied to this day, but to those who stood in his way, he was the scourge of God, a harbinger of death and destruction on an unimaginable scale. The chronicles of the 13th century are filled with tales of cities razed to the ground, of entire populations put to the sword. The Mongol conquests redrew the map of the world, leaving a legacy of fear that would echo for centuries. But beneath these well-known stories of conquest and carnage lies a dark, more personal tragedy, a chapter of history that is often overlooked or spoken of only in hushed tones. This is the story of the women, the countless female captives who fell into the hands of the Mongol armies. Even the most battle-hardened chroniclers of the time, men who were no strangers to the brutalities of medieval warfare, wrote with a sense of shock and horror about the fate of these women. Their accounts paint a harrowing picture that goes beyond the typical spoils of war. To understand what happened, we must first look at the structure and customs of Mongol society itself. Before Genghis Khan, the Mongolian plateau was a chaotic patchwork of nomadic tribes, constantly at war with one another. In this harsh environment, raids for resources, livestock, and, crucially, women were a common feature of life. A man's wealth and status were often measured by the number of horses and wives he possessed. Capturing women from rival tribes was not just a consequence of conflict, it was often a primary objective. This practice, known as wife-stealing, was deeply ingrained in the culture. In fact, Genghis Khan's own mother, Holan, was abducted by his father Yasu, and in a turn of fate, Genghis Khan's first wife, Bert, was later kidnapped by a rival tribe, an event that fueled his relentless drive to unify the Mongols and end the cycle of internal warfare. He understood firsthand the chaos and pain caused by these raids. When Genghis Khan united the tribes, he didn't eliminate this tradition, he redirected it. He codified Mongol laws in a text known as the Yasa. While the Yasa forbade the abduction of women within the Mongol nation, this protection did not extend to a single person outside of it. The practice of capturing women was now turned outward, against the enemies of the Mongol Empire. It became an institutionalized part of their military strategy. So, what happened when the thundering hooves of the Mongol cavalry descended upon a city or a kingdom? The process was methodical and terrifyingly efficient. After a city was taken, either by surrender or by force, the population would be herded out into the open fields. There, a systematic process of sorting would begin. Artisans and engineers, blacksmiths, carpenters, siege experts were often spared and sent back to the Mongol heartland to contribute their skills to the empire. Young, able-bodied men were conscripted into the Mongol army, often used as human shields, were forced to lead the charge in the next siege. The rest of the male population, his Astasia fighters, and the old and infirm were typically executed without mercy. But for the women, a different fate awaited. They were sorted based on their beauty, youth, and social standing. The most beautiful women, particularly the wives and daughters of a city's defeated ruler, were reserved for Genghis Khan himself and his sons. They became part of the imperial household, entering the Khan's harems. This was not just an act of lust, it was a powerful political statement. By taking the women of a defeated king, the Khan symbolically absorbed his enemy's power and lineage, utterly humiliating him and erasing his dynasty. The remaining women were then distributed among the Mongol generals and soldiers as a primary form of payment and reward. A soldier's share of the loot wasn't just gold, silk, or livestock, it was human beings. Tens of thousands of women from Persia, Russia, China, and Eastern Europe were divided up like property. A Persian historian, Atamalik Hubani, who served the Mongols and witnessed Nihova conquests firsthand, wrote about this with a chilling metric. He described how after the fall of a city, the Mongols drove out the ladies of the court, who were used to being veiled and protected, and distributed them among their soldiers. He noted the despair and horror of these women, torn from their families and forced into a life of servitude and brutality. Their lives were unimaginably difficult, stripped of their identity, language, and culture. They were forced to serve their new masters in every capacity. They cooked, cleaned, tended to the livestock, and were subjected to constant abuse. They bore children, tampin, for their captors. Children who were raised as Mongols. Cultural heritage erased. For many, this was a fate worse than death. Numerous accounts tell of women choosing to take their own lives rather than submit. The sheer scale of this practice is staggering. After the conquest of the Khwarezmian Empire in Central Asia, it's said that every Mongol soldier, from the highest general to the lowest trooper, received numerous female captives. The Mongol army at the time numbered well over 100,000 men. The math is horrifying. We are talking about hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of women captured and enslaved over the course of the conquests. This wasn't a secret or a shameful byproduct of war. It was a declared, open policy. It served multiple purposes for the Mongol Empire. Firstly, it was a powerful incentive for the soldiers. The promise of female captives was a greater motivator than gold for many of the warriors. It ensured their loyalty and ferocity in battle. Secondly, it was a tool of terror. The knowledge that defeat meant not just death for the men, but the enslavement and violation of their wives, sisters, and daughters was a potent psychological weapon. It was designed to break the enemy's will to resist before a single arrow was fired. Many cities surrendered to avoid this very fate, though surrender didn't always guarantee safety. Thirdly, and perhaps most consequentially for history, it had a massive demographic impact. The Wickromosome of Genghis Khan is famously one of the most successful in human history. Modern genetic studies have shown that approximately 1 in every 200 men alive today is a direct line descendant of the Khan. That's about 16 million men. This incredible genetic legacy wasn't achieved through his official wives alone. It is the direct result of this systematic policy of capturing and impregnating thousands of women across Asia and Europe. Genghis Khan and his sons had vast harems filled with women from conquered nations. Their offspring, in turn, were given their own harems, perpetuating this genetic spread across the largest empire on earth. While we often focus on the political and military aspects of the Mongol Empire, this hidden history of its female victims is crucial to understanding its true nature. It reveals a level of calculated brutality that is hard to comprehend. The trauma inflicted upon these women was not just personal. It was a strategic pillar of the Mongol war machine. Their suffering was fuel for the empire's expansion. The stories of these women are largely lost to history. They were, for the most part, illiterate, and their captors had no interest in recording their individual experiences. They exist only as statistics in the chronicles of conquerors, nameless and faceless. But their silent legacy lives on in the DNA of millions and in the chilling accounts of those who witnessed their tragedy. So when we think of Genghis Khan, it's important to look beyond the image of the brilliant conqueror. We must also remember the burned cities, the slaughtered populations, and, most importantly, the stolen women. Their story is a stark and uncomfortable reminder of the true cost of empire and the hidden atrocities that are so often written out of the grand narratives of history. It's a part of the past we must not forget. In the heart of the vast, unforgiving Mongolian steppe, a child was born who would one day hold the world in his grasp. His name was Temujin, but history would know him as Genghis Khan. His story isn't just one of conquests. It is a chilling testament to how the deepest scars of a brutal childhood can forge an empire built on fear. Imagine a world where survival is a daily battle. This was Temujin's reality. The steppe was a landscape of extremes, scorching summers and bone-chilling winters, but the climate was the least of his worries. The real danger came from other people. The Mongol tribes were a fractured, feuding collection of clans, constantly at war with each other over resources, territory, and honor. Alliances were as shifting as the desert sands, and betrayal was as common as the air they breathed. Into this chaos, Temujin was born around 1160. His father Yasuge was a minor clan chief. When Temujin was just 9 years old, his father arranged a marriage for him with a girl named Bert from another tribe, a strategic move to build an alliance. On the journey home, after leaving Temujin with his future in-laws, Yasuge was poisoned by a rival Tatar clan. His death shattered Temujin's world. Suddenly, the boy who was the son of a chief became an outcast. His father's own clan, seeing no use for a widow and her young children, abandoned them. They were cast out onto the steppe to fend for themselves, a death sentence for most. This was Temujin's first, and perhaps most profound, lesson in human cruelty. He learned that loyalty was a luxury, and power was the only thing that guaranteed survival. The years that followed were a relentless struggle against starvation and persecution. Temujin, his mother, and his siblings survived by eating roots, rodents, and whatever they could forage. Hunger was a constant companion, but even more terrifying was the threat from other clans. He was a target, the son of a murdered chief, a loose end that rival clans wanted to tie up permanently. He and his family were hunted like animals. One of the most defining moments of his youth came when a rival clan, the Taishiadis, who had once been allied with his father, captured him. They locked him in a wooden kang, a heavy yoke that pinned his head and hands. He was humiliated, paraded as a trophy, a symbol of their dominance. But even in this state of absolute helplessness, a fire was kindled in Temujin. He wasn't broken. He was learning. He observed his captors, studied their weaknesses, and waited for his chance. One night, during a feast, he saw an opportunity. He struck his guard with a heavy wooden yoke and fled into the darkness, plunging into a river to hide among the reeds. A single searcher found him. But in a rare act of mercy, or perhaps seeing a spark of something extraordinary in the boy's eyes, pretended not to see him. This one act of kindness stood in stark contrast to the world of betrayal he knew, but it didn't teach him to be merciful. It taught him that mercy was a random, unreliable anomaly. True security, he concluded, lay in ensuring no one ever had the power to show you mercy or cruelty again. It lay in absolute control. After his escape, Temujin's resolve hardened. He was no longer just surviving, he was planning. He began the slow, arduous process of gathering followers. He sought out his promised wife, Bert, and their reunion formed the bedrock of his first real alliance. But the cycle of violence continued. Soon after their marriage, Bert was kidnapped by the Merkit tribe, an act of revenge for a raid his own mother had been a victim of a generation earlier. For Temujin, the world had taken his father, his status, and now his wife. He refused to accept it. He forged a critical alliance with two powerful figures, his father's old blood brother, Tagrelkan, and his own childhood blood brother, Jamuk. Together, they raised an army and attacked the Merkits, crushing them and rescuing Bert. This victory was a turning point. It wasn't just a personal triumph, it was a public declaration. Temujin was a leader who would go to any length to protect what was his and to avenge any wrong done to him. He had shown strength, and on the steppe, strength attracted followers. Warriors began to flock to his banner, drawn by his charisma, his military genius, and his reputation for rewarding loyalty. As his power grew, so did the friction with his childhood friend, Jamuka. They were two different kinds of leaders. Jamuka believed in the traditional aristocratic structure of the steppe, where leadership was a birthright of the noble class. Temujin, the outcast, believed in a meritocracy. He promoted men based on skill and loyalty, not their lineage. This revolutionary idea was incredibly appealing to the common warrior, but a direct threat to the established order that Jamuka represented. Their friendship eventually fractured into a bitter rivalry, plunging the Mongol tribes into a civil war. This was the final crucible that forged the man who would become Genghis Khan. The war against Jamuka was brutal and personal. It forced Temujin to be utterly ruthless. He couldn't afford to show weakness. He couldn't afford to leave enemies at his back. During one battle, Temujin was shot in the neck with an arrow and nearly killed. After winning the battle, he demanded to know who had fired the shot. A warrior named Zargadai stepped forward and confessed, expecting to be executed. Instead, seeing his courage and honesty, Temujin spared him, gave him a new name, Jib, meaning arrow, and made him one of his generals. Jib would go on to become one of his most brilliant and loyal commanders. This was Temujin's philosophy in action. Destroy your enemies completely, but recognize and reward strength, even in a foe. By 1206, after years of brutal warfare, Temujin had done the impossible. He had defeated all his rivals, including Jamuka, and united the warring Mongol tribes under a single banner. At a great assembly or Kurultai, he was proclaimed the universal ruler, the Genghis Khan. The man who now led the unified Mongol nation was a product of his past. The boy who starved now ensured his armies were the best supplied in the world. The boy who was betrayed now demanded absolute, unquestioning loyalty, punishing treason with death. The boy who was hunted and humiliated now believed that the only way to ensure the security of his people and himself was through total domination. Mercy was weakness, because it created the potential for future betrayal. Fear was strength, because it ensured compliance. This philosophy was unleashed upon the world with terrifying efficiency. When Genghis Khan turned his gaze outward from Mongolia, he saw a world of city-states and empires that to him looked just like the squabbling, treacherous clans of his youth. He offered them a choice: submit or be annihilated. When the Khwarezmian Empire in Central Asia murdered his envoys, it was a personal insult that echoed the betrayals of his past. His response was not just a war, it was an extermination. Cities like Samarkand and Bukhara, centers of learning and culture, were razed to the ground. Populations were massacred with a cold, systematic brutality that sent a wave of terror across the globe. His generals were ordered to leave no one alive in rebellious cities, to build pyramids of skulls as a warning to others. This wasn't random violence, it was psychological warfare, honed on the steppe. It was a calculated strategy to break the will of his enemies before the first arrow was even fired. The name Genghis Khan became synonymous with destruction, a force of nature that swept away entire civilizations. He believed that to secure a lasting peace for his people, he had to eliminate any and all potential threats. His empire was built on the ashes of those who defied him. The brutal experiences of his youth, loss of his father, the abandonment by his clan, the constant hunger, the humiliation of captivity, and the endless betrayals didn't just shape Temujin. They created Genghis Khan. They taught him that the world was a dangerous place where only the strong and the ruthless survive. And so he became the strongest, most ruthless ruler the world had ever seen, forging an empire that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the heart of Europe, an empire born from the pain of a boy abandoned on the unforgiving plains. This was the Mongol vanguard. They weren't there for a decisive battle. Their job was reconnaissance and disruption. They were the eyes and ears of the great Khan, mapping your city's defenses, counting your soldiers, and, most importantly, cutting you off. Supply lines were severed. Messengers trying to call for help vanished into the steppe. Farms and villages in your city's orbit were systematically plundered or burned. Suddenly, your prosperous city became an isolated, terrified island. This initial phase could last for days, even weeks. It was a war of nerves. The Mongol horsemen would appear, launch a volley of arrows, and then disappear before your soldiers could even mount a proper response. They were ghosts on horseback, masters of the Hitnarn, designed to wear you down, to exhaust your men and drain your will to fight. You'd send out a cavalry charge, only for them to feign a retreat, luring your best knights into a perfectly laid ambush. This feigned retreat was one of their most devastating tactics. Frustrated commanders, eager for a victory, would fall for it time and again, only to see their elite forces surrounded and annihilated by a hail of arrows from all sides. The Mongol bow was a marvel of engineering, a composite weapon of horn, sinew. This wasn't an idle threat. It was policy. The world had seen brutal conquerors before, but none were so systematic. The Mongols used terror as a strategic tool. When a city like Samarkand or Nishapur resisted, they didn't just sack it, they annihilated it. They would divert rivers to wash away the very foundations, slaughter the population, and build gruesome pyramids of skulls as a monument to their wrath. The stories of these massacres were deliberately spread. Merchants, refugees, and the few survivors allowed to escape carried the tales of horror to the next city on the Mongolesque path. So, by the time the dust cloud appeared on your horizon, you had already heard the stories. No effect. The fear of Mongol retribution often did more damage than the Mongol army itself. Alliances crumbled. Kings would rather submit to a distant Khan than risk annihilation. Cities would open their gates without a fight, their leaders knowing that resistance was futile and its cost unimaginable. Their command structure was also revolutionary. It was a pure meritocracy. A common shepherd could rise to become a general if he proved his worth in battle. Each warrior traveled with a string of spare horses, allowing them to cover vast distances at incredible speeds, living off the land or their own herds. This meant they could appear where they were least expected, striking deep into enemy territory before a defense could even be organized. It was the lightning-fast reconnaissance, the feigned retreats, the mastery of archery, the brilliant use of psychological warfare, the absorption of foreign technology, the brutal policy of terror, and the ironclad discipline. They didn't just defeat armies. They dismantled societies. They broke the will of their enemies long before they broke their walls. They were not just conquerors. They were a force of nature, a hurricane of horse and bow that redrew the map of the world through a calculated and terrifying storm of speed, strategy, and fear. Thank you for watching. If you found this look into Mongol warfare fascinating, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the strategies and stories that shaped our history. See you next time. Have you ever wondered how one man could conquer almost the entire known world? When we think of Genghis Khan, we picture vast armies, thundering hooves, and unstoppable force. But what if I told you his most powerful weapon wasn't his cavalry, but his mind? What if his greatest victories were won before a single arrow was even fired? Today, we're diving deep into the hidden genius of Genghis Khan, the master psychologist who used fear as his sharpest sword. Most people see the Mongol conquests as a story of pure brute force, a tidal wave of warriors that simply overwhelmed everyone in their path. And yes, the Mongol army was incredibly disciplined, skilled, and mobile. But that's only half the story. The real secret to their success was a sophisticated campaign of psychological warfare, orchestrated by Genghis Khan himself. He understood a fundamental truth of human nature. The fear of pain is often more powerful than the pain itself. A broken spirit is just as defeated as a broken body. So, how did he do it? It all started with information. The Mongols were masters of intelligence gathering. Before they even approached a city or a kingdom, their spies, merchants, and envoys had already been there. They learned everything. The political situation, the strength of the defenses, the rivalries between leaders, and most importantly, what the people feared. They were creating a psychological profile of their enemy long before the first soldier appeared on the horizon. Then came the rumors. This wasn't just battlefield gossip. It was a carefully crafted narrative of terror. Stories would begin to circulate in towns and cities that were next on the Mongols' path. Tales of entire populations being wiped out, of pyramids made of skulls, of rivers running red. The stories were always graphic, specific, and designed to prey on the deepest anxieties of the populace. They would describe the Mongols as inhuman, almost demonic figures, a force of nature that couldn't be reasoned with or stopped. You might be thinking, were these stories true? Some were based on real events, but they were almost always exaggerated to an extreme degree. For example, if a city resisted fiercely, the Mongols would indeed be ruthless. They would make an example of that city, and they would make sure the story of its fate traveled far and wide. This is where the psychological genius comes in. The cruelty wasn't random, it was strategic. It was a message. Each act of brutality was an investment in future, bloodless victories. The message was simple and brutally effective. Resist, and you will face annihilation. Surrender, and you will be spared. The Mongols would often send envoys ahead of their main army with these exact terms. "We offer you a choice," they'd say. "Join us, and you will share in our wealth and our victories. Fight us, and your city will become dust, and your people's fate will be a cautionary tale for generations." Imagine you're a citizen in a walled city. For weeks, you've heard nothing but terrifying stories about the approaching horde. You've heard about cities that resisted and were utterly destroyed. Then, a Mongol envoy arrives. He doesn't look like the monster from the stories. He's just a man, delivering a stark choice. The offer of surrender suddenly sounds less like cowardice and more like common sense. The fear that has been building up inside you for weeks now has a release valve. submission. This strategy created deep divisions within the cities they targeted. The nobles and military leaders might want to fight for honor, but the merchants and common people, terrified for their lives and livelihoods, would often pressure them to surrender. Genghis Khan was turning his enemies against themselves. He was winning the battle for the hearts and minds, or rather, the fears and anxieties of the people before his army even had to draw their swords. This tactic was incredibly efficient. Every city that surrendered without a fight was a victory. It saved Mongol lives. It preserved the city's infrastructure and wealth, which could then be taxed, and it added the city's soldiers to the Mongol ranks. The Mongol Empire grew not just by conquering, but by absorbing. The terror was a tool to facilitate that absorption. It was a filter. Those who resisted were eliminated, and those who submitted were integrated. We often look at historical figures through a very simple lens: good or evil, hero or villain. But Genghis Khan was far more complex. He was a nation builder, a brilliant military strategist, and a ruthless conqueror. But perhaps his most overlooked and most fascinating role was that of a master psychologist. He didn't just command an army of soldiers. He commanded an army of fear. He understood that the battlefield of the mind was just as important as the battlefield of the earth. He waged war on morale, on certainty, and on hope. And by winning that war first, the physical conquest often became a mere formality. The shadow of his army was often more devastating than the army itself. So the next time you think of the Mongol Empire, remember it wasn't just built on the strength of their bows or the speed of their horses. It was built on a profound and terrifying understanding of human psychology. It was a stark reminder that the most powerful empires are often built not just with steel, but with stories. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this dive into the psychology of history interesting, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more content that looks beyond the headlines of the past. Let me know in the comments what other historical strategies you'd like to explore. See you in the next one.